Hello and welcome to part 4 of this series for Kerbal Space Program 2 for Science. So in the last video we did our very first launch to the moon and we orbited around the moon and then came back. However, in this launch we're actually going to be going to the moon to land. So as you can see, if we go into the mission control building, you can see that we have the One Small Step mission available, which we're going to track. However, we are also going to be able to do a few different secondary missions on this launch as well. So the first thing we're going to do is we're actually also going to track a perfect circle, because that requires us to get to 100 kilometers, or in a circular orbit at 100 kilometers above Kerbin. And of course, first dibs is planting the flag, which we'll do once we land. So as you can see, I have actually built 2 rockets. Both of these rockets would actually do this mission. However, we are going to be using the smaller of the 2 for this particular video, because this is the easier one to build. It only uses tier 1 parts as well, whereas the large one does use a handful of tier 2 parts, and it also has a 2-stage lander as well, a bit like an Apollo lander. But we will get into that one in possibly the next video, or maybe the one after that. Either way, this rocket would definitely get us to the moon and back, and it will also get you to Minmus and back easily. So we're going to be using both of these rockets for the next few videos, and if you'd like to see how to build either of these, as I said, I do have a build video for the tier 1 rocket, and I will also have a build video for the tier 2 one as well. So yeah, let's get straight into the launch. So here we are on the pad, ready to launch. You'll notice that I have actually turned off the HUD for this. You can, if you want to cycle through the HUD, press F2 on your keyboard. And it just means that you can actually get some pretty awesome screenshots while you're going through your mission. But anyway, before we do take off, there is one last thing that I would like to do. I'm going to do a little bit of rearranging of the staging stack, and this isn't strictly necessary. You could launch it as it currently stands. However, what I like to do is I like to create a new stage and put it right at the bottom. And then if we put the 2 solid rocket boosters in that stage, what that will do is it will ignite the SRBs before we actually unclamp from the launch clamps. And that theoretically should put a bit of tension into the launch clamps before we take off, meaning that we're more likely to go straight up instead of dipping down when we take off. The only thing you need to be aware of when you're doing this though is that the launch clamps are now in stage 2, so once the countdown is finished it won't automatically launch. You'll need to stage again to decouple the clamps. But anyway, let's get into this launch. So this is going to be a pretty standard launch. We're going to launch to 2,500 meters as usual, and then once we reach 2,500 meters on our altitude meter, we're going to pitch down the 90-degree line at approximately, well, 90 degrees. So as we're pitching, we're naturally going to try and keep the level indicator pointing towards the bottom of the green prograde marker on the nav ball. Now we are going to need to keep an eye on the fuel in our solid rocket boosters on the staging stack, and once that has depleted then we can decouple the solid boosters. And then once again we'll just keep pitching down steadily until we reach 45 degrees on the nav ball, and once there it's just a matter of waiting until we reach our desired altitude. Now, of course, in previous missions we have been aiming for 85,000 meters apoapsis on the orbital info panel. However, because we're also aiming to complete the perfect circle mission, we're going to aim to reach 100,000 meters this time instead. So if you're not aiming to get to 100,000 meters on this particular launch, going to above 75,000 meters should give you enough room below the orbit to do any maneuvers you need to do to circularize your orbit. And once we start to get to 100,000 meters, we will then reduce the throttle and basically manage our throttle until we are at the desired altitude. So now we're at 100,000 meters, we just need to create our circularization burn. So as usual, we'll go to the map and focus on Kerbin, and then we are just going to create a maneuver node on the apoapsis and pull out on the prograde arrow until the periapsis and apoapsis markers reach 90 degrees from the maneuver node. And then once there, we can use the radial out arrow and the retrograde arrow just to play around with our orbit until the projected orbit gets to around about 100 by 100. So you can see it's not going to actually give us a perfectly 100 by 100 orbit if we do it that way. So what we can do is we can get the apoapsis or periapsis inside of the maneuver node, and then if we extend our apoapsis, we'll get that up to 100,000 meters. And then after we've completed the circularization burn or the orbit burn, we will then circularize our orbit to complete the mission. And of course you need to make sure that you are pointed at the maneuver marker on the nav ball in plenty of time so that we don't run out of time before we need to start our burn. So if you're not using the map screen, you can pay attention to the orbital info panel while in the flight view, and that will give you all the information you need to know. And as I say, we are waiting for our periapsis to be above the atmosphere of Kerbin, so above 70,000 meters, and we're also going to wait until the apoapsis reaches 100,000 meters. And if the rocket does start to rock around a little bit during this phase, just let it do its thing. It shouldn't lose control too much. The surefire way to actually lose control of your rocket is to try and fight the SAS, so we're just going to leave it to do its own thing. And once again, once we reach 100,000 meters in our periapsis on the orbital info panel, we'll reduce the throttle and wait until we are at the desired altitude. And there we are, we now have an apoapsis of 100,000 meters and a periapsis of 85, so we are well into orbit. You can, now we have RCS on the rocket, if we press R on our keyboard or activate the RCS button, we can now use the H and N keys to boost forward or backwards, and we want to actually reduce our apoapsis ever so slightly. We are well within the desired area, but we're going to get that down to about 100, and then we're going to move on to the circularization burn. So of course, with any circularization burn, we want to go onto the map, look down upon Kerbin, and then we are going to find our apoapsis. And once there, we'll just create a maneuver node. We don't actually need to use a maneuver node on this, but for circularization in this purpose, we're going to create a maneuver node. And then, as with any maneuver like this, we're going to pull outwards on the prograde arrow until the orange Kerbin apoapsis appears. Highlight that, and then we're just going to pull this in until we get to around about 100,000 meters, and the two markers are at 90 degrees from the maneuver node. Now, as usual, it can be very faffy getting it to perfect, but you can see at the moment we're on 100 by 100.032 versus 100.022, so a 10 meter difference. You can't get much closer than that. And that is, as I've said, only our projected orbit. That isn't necessarily going to be the final orbit, because we aren't going to be using the maneuver on the map screen. We're going to be going back to flight view and performing the burn this way. The only reason we actually need the maneuver is to make sure that we, start burning at the correct time. So as usual, we'll point at the maneuver, and then we will warp forwards and circularize our orbit. So because it's only going to be a very short burn, we're actually going to use partial throttle, and we're going to keep an eye on the apoapsis or periapsis even on the orbital info panel. And once the two have matched up, we'll automatically get the mission. And there we have an almost perfect circular orbit. So as you saw, we now have completed our perfect circle mission. Now, before we even think about going to the moon, what we can actually do is, if we press F5 to save, and then go to the mission control building, we can actually submit the science or the report for a perfect circle. And once we have done that, we now have a new secondary mission. It's Eccentric, and this requires us to get an apoapsis of 300 to 8,000 kilometers by a periapsis of 70 to 150. So since we're already at 100 kilometers, as soon as we get to 300 kilometers above Kerbin during our translunar injection burn, we will automatically get this mission. So it just saves us having to launch another rocket and doing this mission later on. So yeah, to get back to our ship then, we're going to need to go to tracking station. We are going to find the ship that we want to control, right click on that and hit control. The way to actually gain control of the rocket again though is to click on it, and then on the right hand side you can see there's a green button for control, and we'll click that and now we'll go straight back to our rocket. So when going to the moon, the first thing we need to do, of course, is select the moon as our target. So we'll right click on the moon in the map screen and set as target. And this is the point that I think a lot of people probably miss out when doing any orbital maneuvers, whether it be, well, rendezvous maneuvers, even when it's rendezvousing with either a planet or with another ship, and that is changing our ascending node and descending node and making them to 0.0 degrees, because we need to match our orbital inclination. And a quick explanation of what an orbital inclination is: if we were at 0 degrees, we would be perfectly flat along the equator of Kerbin, whereas if we were at, say, 90 degrees, we would actually be going north. So we've got 45 degrees there, 0 degrees there, and 90 degrees, and it just basically means how steep your orbit around the planet is. So that's what inclination means, essentially. So because we are approaching the descending node, we're actually going to do this maneuver without a maneuver plan. And to do that, as I've said, if you're approaching the ascending node, you would want to point your ship at anti-normal, whereas if you are approaching the descending node, you would want to point normal. So because we're approaching the descending node, we're actually going to make sure we are pointed at normal on the nav ball, and then once the level indicator has settled on the correct marker on the nav ball, we're going to warp to a point just ahead of the descending node, or as I say, if it was the ascending node, the next node on the orbit basically. So we'll warp to a point just ahead of there, and once our ship marker reaches the descending node, we're actually going to increase the throttle a little bit, and we're going to wait until our inclination reaches 0.0 degrees. There we are now matched our inclination to the moon's orbital path. So as I say, that is probably the one thing that most people seem to get or seem to miss out when doing any of these maneuvers, and it's possibly the most important thing, because now it means that when we extend our orbit line, it will intersect with the moon's orbit perfectly, as opposed to coming in high or low on the moon. And it just means this way we will definitely be able to get into an equatorial orbit around the moon as well. So as I did in my moon tutorial, we're going to create a maneuver node on the backside of Kerbin, aiming to get our apoapsis at touching the moon's orbit line just ahead of where it currently sits. And we'll know that we are intersecting the moon's orbit when we get the 1A and 2A markers. Then, to actually have an encounter with the moon, we need to pull the maneuver node around, and you can see we're now encountering, and we're going to go pretty low on this one. We're actually aiming for above 60,000 meters, but what I would normally do is I would actually aim for about 75,000 meters. And a little tip, if you want to get finer controls over the movements of the maneuver node, so when we're doing this kind of thing, what you can do is you can use the middle mouse button to detach the camera from whatever you're focusing on, point the little dot in the middle at the maneuver node, and then zoom in. And now we're nice and close to the maneuver node. We can highlight our periapsis or projected periapsis, and now we've got much more fine adjustments over our altitude and where the maneuver node is on the orbit. And as I say, we're going to aim for about 75,000 meters. As long as you're well above 60,000 meters, this should work. If you have less fuel, I would actually recommend going a little bit lower, probably no lower than 25. You don't want to be going too low because you could end up accidentally crashing into the moon, and of course we want to circularize our orbit above the moon. But as I've said before, 60,000 meters is where you transition from high moon orbit into low moon orbit, so we're going to aim for around about 75 on this one. And this is just the altitude that I usually aim for. So now that that is set, all we need to do is point our ship at the maneuver and then perform our translunar injection burn. So when you're on the map screen, as usual, when doing this burn, you can detach the camera and space everything out a little bit easier. And you can see that now our periapsis has reached above, our apoapsis has reached above 300,000 meters, which means we automatically got the eccentric mission. So that's that one out of the way. And the only thing we're going to do now is wait until our apoapsis reaches relatively close, and so essentially once we start to encounter the moon's sphere of influence, then we will want to reduce the throttle and manage our throttle until we have completed the burn. So as I say, now we've actually got an encounter with the moon, what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to delete this maneuver node. You don't have to, but I'm going to delete the maneuver node, lock the periapsis information in place, and then increase the throttle until we reach approximately 75,000 meters above the surface. And once we're close, we can cut the throttle, and if you go a little bit over, you can just activate RCS again and use the N and H keys to adjust your altitude. So 75.4 should do the trick. So now all we need to do is transfer from the Kerbin to the moon. So as usual, we will time warp to point. Now, as with any orbital maneuver around the moon, we're going to then focus on the moon, find our periapsis, and we're just going to do the standard orbital adjustments of playing around with the various different arrows on the maneuver node until we get a circular orbit. Of course, as always, once the orbits are roughly 90 degrees from each other, that's when we want to be starting to adjust. And now we are ready to do our orbital burn. So all we need to do now is, as always, point at the maneuver node or marker on the nav ball, warp to the maneuver, and then perform the burn. So as you can see, we've actually started reducing our periapsis, and our apoapsis isn't quite at the desired location yet, so we can actually point radial out or radial in, and we can make further adjustments using our RCS while in this orientation. So if we press N or H even, we can see that our apoapsis is raising and our periapsis is lowering. So we're actually going to hit N so that we can raise the periapsis and lower the apoapsis. And this can use quite a lot of monopropellant if you're not careful doing this kind of stuff. But like I say, I often use RCS just because it basically means you're using less fuel. And it can take a bit of faffing around until we get there. Or alternatively, the other thing you can do, of course, is just simply create a manoeuvre node and circularise your orbit this way. And when doing any minor orbital adjustments like this, as I say, it's usually best just to use a little bit of RCS and you've got a little bit more control as opposed to trying to use your throttle, because it's very easy to overdo it with the throttle. And there we are at a pretty perfect 75-kilometre orbit. The same thing applies when you're doing any manoeuvres, whether it's with a manoeuvre node or not. As long as you get your apoapsis and periapsis to about 90 degrees from the target ship or the manoeuvre node, you should generally have a relatively circular orbit. So yeah, that is us in orbit around the moon. So we're actually going to leave this video here for now, and we're going to do the landing and takeoff from the moon in the next video. So if you enjoyed this video, please feel free to like and subscribe. I hope you did, and hopefully I will see you in the next one.